The top reasons why marriages end in divorce are commonly known and make sense to us intuitively. Growing apart, money problems, communication breakdowns. You've heard of all of these reasons, but what if we look at those as not being reasons, but as symptoms? If we start looking at the deeper underlying reasons that these symptoms show up, you realize that relationship issues are so much more complicated and nuanced than we'd like to believe. And the reasons why marriages fail often touch on the deepest, darkest parts of our psyche. If we've not met before, my name is Oliver, and I've been a couples therapist here in Los Angeles for nearly a decade now. And when couples come into my office and tell me why their marriage is falling apart, they almost always point to the surface symptoms. But when I dig in, what I find underneath are archetypal patterns that have been described for thousands of years. So I've mapped the 5 most common destructive patterns that I see onto an iceberg, and I will take you from the surface all the way to the bottom in this video. So the surface of the iceberg is the things that you can see. More distance, conflict, but what is hidden underneath is the cause, and the deeper we go, the harder they are to see, and the more damage they do. If you have ever fallen in love with someone's potential, you know what this is. When you love someone for who they could be rather than who they actually are. This is a really common pattern humans experience, and it was first told over 2,000 years ago when the Roman poet Ovid told the story of Pygmalion. He was a sculptor in ancient Cyprus who was so disillusioned by the flaws of the women that he was dating, he carved his own statue out of ivory, his vision of perfection. He dressed it, he kissed it, he bought it gifts, and he fell so deeply in love with his own creation that the goddess Venus brought this thing to life. The Pygmalion effect comes from the idea that Pygmalion's expectations for this statue coming to life came true. And there's a lot of research from the 70s where this term became popular in psychology. And there's this infamous study that shows when teachers were told certain students were about to bloom intellectually, those students actually outperformed their peers. Even though they were chosen at random, they still performed better, and this became known as the Pygmalion effect. What you believe, what you state becomes true. Our expectations unconsciously shape reality. In a classroom, this is really powerful, but in a marriage, when the expectation is that you need to become someone else, it all runs in reverse. See, Pygmalion didn't fall in love with the person, he fell in love with the projection. Something he built that couldn't talk back, couldn't disagree, couldn't be messy or complicated like us humans are. So if you're constantly wishing that your partner would change or be someone else, or hoping that one day they'll be different, it is a sign that the relationship might not be meeting your standards or your needs or your expectations. And if you're staying in that relationship, it's like having the blueprint of your ideal partner pinned to your wall and you being in love with the poster instead of the actual human being standing in front of you. Now, of course, people can grow and change, and maybe they will evolve into what you're hoping for, but banking on someone becoming your ideal version of them is setting yourself up for an uphill battle and a lot of relationship dissatisfaction. More importantly, the person being sculpted eventually feels it. They sense something's missing, and that thing that is missing is your love for who they are right now. The gap between who I am and who you need me to be is really corrosive. And the Pygmalion effect creates this feedback loop. Your expectations become a self-fulfilling prophecy, so you expect your partner to fall short and you'll unconsciously act in ways that guarantee that they do. Even positive expectations to be more successful, be more patient, be perfect, become a pressure cooker. So the person being molded either withdraws from all of these really severe and lofty standards or rebels. So what looks like incompatibility is really one person saying, stop trying to make me into something I'm not. And it leads to a lot of conflict, a lot of dissatisfaction, and is ultimately one of the main reasons why relationships end. So let's go a little bit deeper into the iceberg. This is what I'm calling the Cinderfella Complex. Okay, it's really called the Cinderella Complex because on the surface, this one gets reported as financial problems, power imbalances, or one partner feeling like they're carrying the other. When you dig in, the real issue isn't actually about money or effort. It's about something much deeper, a hidden fear of standing on your own 2 feet. Everyone knows this fairy tale, right? Cinderella's trapped in a miserable life, mistreated, overworked, invisible, until Prince Charming arrives and he sees her true worth and rescues her from it all. There's a glass slipper and a pumpkin and happily ever after. It's probably the most repeated love story in human history, and it has wired something very deep into our collective unconscious, the belief that love means being saved or one person is going to fix everything. That's the story of Cinderella, but I'm calling it the Cinderfella Complex because I actually see it more often in men than women. And it's the same unconscious wish to be taken care of by somebody else rather than taking full responsibility for their own lives. So this is the partner who quietly defers every major decision. Sometimes it's the one who never develops their own career, their own friendships, or even identity outside of the relationship. There's an important nuance here. It's not needy or wrong to have needs. Relying on a partner to feel cared for and loved is healthy and normal. It's attachment, right? That's normal. The Cinderella or Cinderfella complex isn't about needing your partner. It's about needing your partner to be everything for you. Your safety, your identity, your reason for being okay. And that is a very different thing. So first of all, it places this impossible pressure on one partner. The person with this complex unconsciously expects their spouse to fulfill every role, to complete them, to make them happy, to rescue them from their past, take away any uncomfortable feelings. That is not a partnership. That's a fairy tale myth. And the partner carrying that burden eventually cracks under the weight of being responsible for another adult's entire well-being. It creates a lot of stagnation too. Relationships thrive on two people, two healthy adults growing individually and together. But the Cinderella-Cinderfella complex actively suppresses growth. One person may self-sabotage their own ambitions, put off personal goals, avoid developing skills that would make them more independent because independence threatens the entire relationship dynamic. If I can stand on my own, I wouldn't need someone to rescue me. And if I don't need someone to rescue me, then what is this relationship built on? That line of thinking is too frightening, so it never gets asked and the person stays small and dependent. And third, this is the one that often triggers divorce. The person with this complex will prioritize the status of being in a relationship over the quality of the connection. They'll overlook all the red flags. They'll tolerate things that they shouldn't. They'll stay not because the relationship is good or healthy, but because being alone feels impossible. So the driving need to stay in the relationship is safety, not compatibility. And a marriage built on the fear of being alone rather than the desire to be together has a particular kind of fragility to it. And when this marriage ends, and it often does, the Cinderella partner faces something terrifying, not just the loss of the relationship, but the loss of the self they never fully built. So the divorce isn't just a legal event, it's actually an identity crisis for them. The Cinderella-Cinderfella complex is all about being rescued, but what if you're the one who needs to do the rescuing? That's where we're going next. The surface level reason couples give for this effect is usually something about things being unequal. One partner says, I'm doing everything, and they just give up. Occasionally I hear that somebody feels smothered. Both people are saying the truth, but neither can see the pattern underneath. So the white knight or the savior complex is one of the oldest archetypes in Western culture. The armored hero or heroine who rides in, slays the dragon, saves the person in distress. And we love this story. We made movie after movie about it. We also teach children that the highest form of love is self-sacrifice. But there is a part of this mythology that nobody talks about. And that is that the knight needs the dragon, because without a threat to fight, without someone to rescue, the knight has no identity or purpose. So if you take away the distress, the knight doesn't know who they are. The white knight syndrome, sometimes called the savior complex, shows up when one partner's entire sense of self is organized around fixing the other person. They are the responsible one. They're the one who holds it all together, the one who pays the bills, who manages all the emotions, who solves the crisis, who cleans up the messes. And it almost always roots somewhere in childhood. Perhaps a parentified kid who had to look after a parent or manage a sibling, or keep peace in a really unstable home. They learned very early on that love equals responsibility for someone else's well-being. So they unconsciously seek partners who also need rescuing because that's the only version of love that feels real, or perhaps they're the only version of love that they are familiar with. But it does destroy relationships, and it works in both directions at the same time. The person in the savior role slips into a position of being controlling really quickly. offering advice without being asked, stepping in without being invited, starting to make decisions for their partner. And it's not at all malicious. They genuinely believe they know what's best for their partner. But the partner starts to feel like they're living under this magnifying glass where every struggle becomes a crisis that requires intervention from the partner. And there's a general vibe that their partner doesn't see them as capable or competent. So instead of feeling loved, they feel stripped of their independence, stripped of the room to fail and learn on their own. It's basically a parent-child dynamic disguised as devotion. Secondly, love becomes a bit transactional, even if neither person identifies it or realizes it. The savior can harbor this unconscious belief that if I save you, you will never leave me. Their helpfulness is a strategy to earn loyalty. And when the partner doesn't respond with the expected gratitude, or worse, when they start to pull away, the knight starts feeling unseen, exhausted, bitter and resentful because their investment in this person did not deliver the results that they wanted. And here's the darkest part. The savior needs the partner to stay broken, because if the partner actually healed, became independent, found their own strength, the knight would lose their purpose and would have no mission. So there's often an unconscious sabotage in this dynamic, and I see it play out in relationships where someone's struggling with substance use. The knight plays their role perfectly, tidying up the mess from the night before, protecting their partner from consequences, calling out sick for work. It all sounds reasonable enough, except what that person who's struggling really needs is to get sober or go to rehab. The caretaking partner is actually preventing the one who's struggling from hitting rock bottom or seeking actual help, and they both get trapped in this cycle of dysfunction. So the savior complex is all about someone who wants to help you, but doesn't really want you to get better. The next layer below crosses into something most couples don't even want to admit exists in their relationship, and it involves two things people find the hardest to talk about: sex and shame. So let's go there. Relationships often start with a lot of passion, and it is normal for that to soften or fade over time. But in this complex, the erotic element of a relationship completely disappears, often the moment things get serious with engagement, marriage, or children. The surface of this iceberg is we've lost the spark, or we're more like roommates. Or the one I hear constantly in practice is that intimacy just isn't there anymore. And when couples talk about intimacy, they're really meaning the erotic passion that is present at the start of a relationship when things are new and exciting. But this isn't just passion fading over time. This is something more structural. Something was done to that desire unconsciously by one or potentially both partners. This comes from the work of Freud, who noticed something strange in his male patients. He noticed that these men could desire women that they didn't respect, and they could respect women that they didn't desire, but they could not do both at the same time. He called it the Madonna-Whore Complex after the Virgin Mary. The Madonna is pure and sacred and maternal, worthy of devotion. So his patients had split femininity into two boxes, and their marriages were collapsing because once their wife was elevated to the Madonna status, desire was no longer permitted. Now, the name is horribly provocative and absolutely has misogynistic undertones, but the underlying mechanism cuts across genders and orientations. It's not really about men and women, it's about splitting, which is the inability to hold complexity. And a great example of this psychological complexity is the ability to see your partner both as the person who parents your child and someone you find sexually exciting. To feel safe with someone and still feel desire. So centuries of cultural and religious messaging have taught us that purity and sexuality are opposites, that good partners don't also get to be hot partners, and that messaging gets internalized far deeper than most people realize. A relationship might start with real passion, but the moment it gets serious, engagement, marriages, children, something shifts. The partner gets recategorized, right? They move from that desired box into the respectful box. And once they're in that box, the person with this complex cannot bring their full sexual self to them. It feels wrong, bad, dirty, or gross. It feels like defiling something sacred. So the passion doesn't just fade, it gets amputated. And their partner might be left feeling respected, sure, but fundamentally unseen as a sexual being. loved but not wanted. And that is a particular kind of loneliness that is a top reason why marriages end in divorce. Because, of course, this is where infidelity enters. Because the desire didn't just disappear, it often gets outsourced. The Madonna stays at home for emotional stability, parenting. The sexual energy has to go somewhere else, to someone that the person doesn't feel respectful enough of to feel guilty about desiring. That's compartmentalization. Love over here, lust over there, but never in the same place at the same time. What makes this a true relationship killer is the double bind it puts on the partner. Because if you're cast as Madonna, you must stay sexually passive. If you express desire or become sexually provocative, you'll fall off that pedestal. But if you suppress your sexuality, the relationship kind of dies anyway. It's an impossible script. You've got to be pure enough to be loved, but somehow also exciting enough to be wanted. So it's not about the person experiencing this. It's about the person who's having this split in their psyche. The exhaustion of trying to be both or juggling everything to try and get attention from your partner is usually what many people find breaks the marriage. But underneath all of this is a fear of vulnerability. Being truly intimate, which is emotionally and sexually with the same person, one of the most vulnerable things a human being can do. So the splitting is a defense against that. It is so much easier, psychologically speaking, to keep love and desire in separate boxes than to risk bringing your whole self to one person who might hurt you in both boxes. So the final layer often gets written down on the surface as communication issues, or I just don't feel heard anymore. But the communication often didn't break down if this complex is present, because it was never equal in the first place. So you've probably heard the story from Greek mythology about Narcissus. He was a young man of extraordinary beauty who was cursed by the gods to fall in love with himself. He stumbled across a pool of water, saw himself in the reflection, and became so consumed by the image that he saw that he couldn't leave, and he wasted away staring at his own face. It's where narcissistic tendencies come from, but there is a second character in that myth that most people forget, Echo. She was a nymph who fell deeply in love with Narcissus, but she'd been cursed too, and she could never speak her own words. She could only repeat the last words that were spoken to her, which is an echo, right? So she followed Narcissus through the forest, desperate to be seen, but only able to mirror back his language. He never once looked at her, and eventually Echo faded away entirely. Nothing left but a voice repeating someone else's words. So it's how the Greeks described what an echo is. In a marriage, this dynamic is utterly devastating. One partner dominates the whole narrative. It's all about their feelings, their needs. Their version of events become the only reality that matters. The other partner gradually erases themselves. First of all, it's their opinions, then their needs, then sometimes even their identity. Often they've learned somewhere, usually in early life, that the price of connection is self-erasure. Here's how this destroys a marriage, and it's a collaborative destruction because both partners play each of the roles. The Narcissus partner has this bottomless pit of need. No amount of admiration, service, or love from their partner is ever going to be enough because their need for validation is insatiable. They're not capable of receiving what Echo is offering, not really. They're too busy staring at their own reflection to see the person standing next to them. And they're only really interested in hearing what their partner says if it's an agreement. But it doesn't start like this because the Narcissus character often has an incredible amount of charm. They're magnetic at first, confident, attentive. It feels like a real connection. But once the partner is committed, that mask slips. They often become critical, dismissive, distant. The partner is no longer a person, right? They're an object used to manage a fragile self-image. Meanwhile, the Echo partner is doing something equally damaging to themselves, suppressing their own desires, swallowing what they need, not being assertive enough. They'll often amplify their partner's needs, walking on eggshells. They become a voice that can only repeat someone else's words, and over time they risk becoming this really empty version of themselves, invisible, resentful, but drained. Echo needs Narcissus too, though, the caretaking, the proximity to someone who seems special. It gives Echo a borrowed sense of self-worth being next to somebody who's so confident and articulate. And that's why these relationships can last painfully for years. Narcissus needs Echo to confirm their superiority, and Echo needs Narcissus to feel needed at all. It's a mutual codependent strategy disguised as a love story. And the end usually comes in one of two ways. Either Echo finally snaps, the resentment that has been building in silence erupts and they leave, often shocking Narcissus who had genuinely no idea what was wrong. Because, of course, they didn't, because they never looked away from their own reflection long enough to notice, or because Narcissus leaves because the moment Echo asks for something real or something that doesn't agree or align with them, that becomes a wounding moment. Narcissus sees this as incredibly threatening and wounding, so they go find a new pool to gaze into or a new Echo to hear what they're saying back to them. Either way, both characters in this story need a lot of work and a lot of help on their self before they enter a new relationship. This all might sound really dark and gloomy and depressing, but here's what I want you to take from this. These stories have been told for centuries as a warning rather than a sentence or a diagnosis. The real difference between a marriage that ends and one that is much more likely to survive is when both people are willing to look under the surface and say, that's us, that is our pattern. Because you can't fix a pattern you can't name, and if you can name it, then at least you've got something to work on. So knowing the pattern is step one, but what do you actually do about it? How do you break the cycle that might be rooted in your childhood? Well, that's what therapy is for, I'm afraid. That's what relationship counseling can do. It goes beyond the surface. A lot of couples come to see me and they think that their problems are on the surface and have a really hard time going deeper. But if you're able to acknowledge that going deeper is the only way through this iceberg, then you're already winning. So if you like this, if you want more content like this, let me know in the comments. Hit subscribe, like, and follow, and I'll be sure to keep the videos coming. Until next time.